Finding great candidates to hire can be like, well, trying to find a needle in a haystack. Sure, you can post your job to some job board, but then all you can do is hope the right person comes along. Which is why you should try ZipRecruiter for free at ziprecruiter.com/zip. ZipRecruiter doesn't depend on candidates finding you. It finds them for you. Its powerful technology identifies people with the right experience and actively invites them to apply to your job. You get qualified candidates fast. So while other companies might deliver a lot of hay, ZipRecruiter finds you what you're looking for. The needle in the haystack.
See why 4 out of 5 employers who post a job on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free. That's right, free at ziprecruiter.com/zip. That's ziprecruiter.com/zip. ziprecruiter.com/zip.
A solitary pickaxe strikes stone. Clang! Pause. Clang! Its echoes curling through a narrow mountain valley. The air is raw, alive with the tang of brine that hangs over everything here in Saltville, Virginia, as though the land itself was oozing salt. A pale pre-dawn mist clings to the ridgelines like gauze on an unhealed wound. Somewhere in that half-light, the dull glow of furnace stacks flickers against the darkness, feeding the Confederacy's very lifeline. Salt for its armies, salt for its cities, salt for survival. Smoke drifts skyward in lazy ribbons, meeting the low clouds that promise snow by nightfall. Now listen. Beneath the steady hammering of labor comes another sound, the muffled creak of leather, the soft clatter of iron hardware, the breath of hundreds of horses held tight on the reverse slope. Union cavalrymen, faces raw from 200 frozen miles, wait in tense silence. Rifles shift in gloved hands. Frost gathers on beards and sleeves, turning blue wool almost white. They have orders to strike hard and be gone before the valley even notices they were there. Down in the town, families still sleep, unaware that history is exhaling its last calm breath before violence. Before sunrise, fires will bloom, boilers will burst, and a river of brine will run useless to the Holston. A mineral empire, years in the building, will perish in a single winter dawn. I'm Chris Mowery, and this is Stories of the Great War. And today we'll look at the Saltville Raid of 1864, how salt, blood, and strategy collided in one icy valley, and why its echoes still sting in the Appalachian air. This story is an opportunity for me to bring two of my great passions together. One is study of the American Civil War, and the other one is the research into my own family history. I've been a professional genealogist for about 30 years now, and somewhere along the way, I began to take a deep dive into the stories of my ancestors and even other relatives who fought in the American Civil War. I'm very blessed in that I have 13 direct ancestors, and by that I mean like great-great-great-grandfathers, not uncles, not cousins, people from whom I descend directly. 13 of them who fought in the American Civil War, and most of them served in eastern Kentucky because that's where most of my bloodline comes from. And it was along the way that I was digging into the story of, I think it was probably the 40th Kentucky Mounted Infantry, because I have 3 ancestors who were in that unit. As I was digging into the 40th Kentucky, I started coming across references to the Saltville Raid. Now, I've been studying the Civil War for most of my life, back to childhood, and until that point in my life, I had never heard of the Saltville Raid. I figured it had to be something minor of very little importance, or else I certainly would have heard about it sooner. But no, as I dug into it and as I saw the involvement that my own family had in this seemingly insignificant moment in Civil War history, I realized just how vital this was to General Grant's overall strategy to squeeze the Confederacy into submission. So I want to take a deep dive into this topic today. I actually learned a ton in just doing the research for this podcast today, and eventually I do plan to make a trip to the battlefield itself. There's actually two Saltville raids, and we're going to talk about both of them today. One was unsuccessful, thus necessitating the second one. And there's also an incident connected to the first Saltville raid that goes underreported in the history telling of the Civil War as well. And that's an incident known as the Saltville Massacre. So we're going to cover all of that today, and I invite you to join me on the journey. Picture a wooden barrel sealed tight with iron hoops. Inside is not gunpowder or whiskey, but something every bit as important. Granules of the color of winter twilight, biting on the tongue, stinging on fresh cuts. It's salt. In 1864, the Confederacy's armies marched, fought, and quite literally survived on salt. Without salt, meat rotted, hides decayed, wounds festered, and horses sickened. A single company of infantry could consume more than 100 pounds of salt a week when you consider rations, medical brine, and leather curing. Multiply that by 100 brigades, and you begin to sense why the Union High Command talked about salt with the same intensity it reserved for railroads and river crossings. Early in the war, Southern planters believed that they had salt to spare. The Gulf Coast was dotted with shallow pan works. Louisiana's Avery Island alone could turn out 2,000 bushels of salt a day. And yes, they did use bushels to measure salt. I had to look that up because it seemed strange to me. But Union blockading squadrons hammered these coastal cities. And once Admiral Farragut seized New Orleans in 1862, the Atlantic and Gulf pans became easy targets. Florida's marshy flats kept trickling out a few hundred bushels here and there, but they were a raindrop in a drought. So that left the inland fields. Chief among them is the complex at Saltville in southwestern Virginia. Two adjacent towns, Saltville and Allison Gap, straddled a glistening vein of brine so strong, locals joked you could plant fence posts upside down and pull up pickled roots. Over 40 miles of iron pipe funneled super salty water from the hillside wells into great steaming kettles, each big enough to scald a wagon team. Day and night, enslaved laborers and conscript workers fed furs worth of hardwood into furnace mouths that never shut down. By the summer of 1864, the works were refining nearly 4,000 bushels every 24 hours, though I've read reports where they could increase that to as many as 10,000, which was enough, according to Confederate commissary reports, to cure an entire week's worth of bacon for Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. These numbers, though, told a grim story. Richmond's Quartermaster Bureau estimated it needed about 2 ounces of salt for every pound of pork set to the front. In a single winter month, Lee's soldiers alone consumed roughly 3.5 million pounds of meat. So if you do the math, you arrive at about 4,000 bushels of salt every week just to keep one main field army fed. Saltville's production wasn't just a luxury. This was the beating heart that kept gray uniforms standing in the muddy trenches from Petersburg to the Shenandoah Valley. But salt's importance goes beyond the camp kettles. Surgeons mixed saturated brine into disinfectant washes. It was crude by modern standards, but it turned septic wounds into potentially survivable ones. Tanners relied on salt to fix hides into marching boots and harness leather. Artillery shops even sprinkled salt on wet black powder to draw out excess moisture before drying and regraining the charge. From crusts of bacon to the heel of a boot to the shell bursting overhead, salt laced the Confederacy's entire war machine. It's no surprise, then, that Union generals framed their 1864 winter strategy around striking the enemy where he eats. Major General George Stoneman's orders from the War Department read like a butcher's knife across a lifeline. Quote, "Render the saltworks at Saltville wholly useless, end quote. Destroying rail ties and telegraph lines was annoying. Destroying Saltville threatened starvation. Confederate authorities knew this too, so they dug rifle pits on every ridge. Some of those can still be seen on the battlefield today. They mounted artillery on Chestnut Mountain. They garrisoned the valley with home guards, with regular infantry, even teenage cadets from the Virginia Military Institute. Engineers drew up contingency plans for flooding the brine wells or rolling boilers into ravines in case retreat became inevitable. In essence, the South gambled the fate of its salt on the sharp folds of Appalachian geography. And so as 1864 unfolded into a steel-gray winter, two unbreakable wills converged on one important resource. On the Confederate side, defend the salt or watch your army starve. On the Union side, smash the salt and shorten the war. From that collision of necessity, the battles and the massacre that followed would sear the name of Saltville into Civil War memory for all time. So let's take a step back and look at the strategic situation in late September of 1864. The war is about to enter its fourth hard winter, and every front is in violent motion. In Georgia, William Tecumseh Sherman has just forced the fall of Atlanta, punching a smoking hole into the Confederacy's industrial midsection. In the Shenandoah Valley, Phil Sheridan is whipping Jubal Early and laying Barnes to the torch, choking off Robert E. Lee's breadbasket. And in Petersburg's trenches, Ulysses S. Grant and George Gordon Meade are grinding forward yard by bloody yard, certain that Lee's army can be strangled if its arteries of food and supply are cut off. And it's against that backdrop that the Appalachian highlands of southwest Virginia, which at first seem remote, seem to be immediately connected. If you take a look closer, you see two thin, twisting railroads, the Virginia in Tennessee and the East Tennessee in Georgia, which form an umbilical cord from the salt kettles in Saltville and the lead mines at Wytheville, straight to the Confederate heartland. You take out those railroad lines, and Lee's wagons roll empty. His soldiers, instead of getting salted meat, get spoiled meat, or none at all. Confederate President Jefferson Davis understands the peril. In mid-September, he rides the rails from Richmond to Palmetto, Georgia, pleading with general after general to hold the interior. But troops are hard to come by. Hood's battered Army of Tennessee needs every musket it can steal from quiet sectors. Lee, frozen in front of Petersburg, can't spare a single brigade. And so the responsibility for guarding Saltville falls to scratched-together forces, local militia, home guard cavalry, and a handful of regulars under Brigadier General Alfred Jackson, as well as a scattering of guerrilla bands who know every mountain trace better than any topographical engineer. The Union, on the other hand, is hunting leverage. Major General Stephen Burbridge commands the District of Kentucky, a land still riddled with clandestine rebel recruiters as well as bushwhackers. Burbridge reports to Grant that a quick thrust through the Cumberland Gap could tear up the saltworks, yank up miles of railroad track, and force the Confederacy to divert badly needed veterans from Virginia. Grant agrees. Pressure everywhere, relief nowhere. That's the order of the day. And so he authorizes the first Saltville Raid. Now, logistically, it's daring. Burbridge needs to haul artillery across knife-edge ridges, feed cavalry horses on thin mountain grass, and fight in country where every barn could be hiding a rifleman. But the chessboard demands that they take a risk. While Sherman marches to the sea and Sheridan sweeps the valley, Burbridge must thrust for the salt, transforming a geographic backwater into a strategic hinge in Union strategy. And so by the first frost of 1864, the pieces are in place. On one side, a Confederate defense stretched like paper over the peaks, betting on terrain and local defense. On the other, a Union command willing to gamble men and miles for the chance to starve an enemy into surrender. On September 27, 1864, General Burbridge, who was technically a brigadier general. I referred to him as Major General earlier. He was a brevet Major General, but officially Brigadier General. He was a square-jawed Kentuckian that was known to friend and foe alike as Butcher Burbridge for his harsh counter-guerrilla orders, which often included executions, imprisonment without trial, and anything else he thought was absolutely necessary to keep the peace in eastern Kentucky. He issued his orders to his staff on the Tennessee side of the Cumberland Gap. He unrolled a damp map across a saddle blanket, tapped the mark that said Saltville, 55 road miles to the east, and then stabbed a finger in the direction of every officer, saying, "We move within the hour. We destroy the works, or we die trying." His command is a patchwork. It's about 4,500 troopers from Kentucky and Ohio, 2 mountain howitzers dragged on mule carts, and most controversially, especially in this part of the country, about 600 black cavalrymen of the 5th and 6th United States Colored Cavalry. These are black soldiers led by white officers. These, many of them former slaves, ride battered horses, still learning the saber drill. But they bring with them a fierce resolve, a chance to strike at the system that once owned their bodies. Supplies for the operation are thin. Quartermaster ledgers show oats cut to half rations and bacon down to 3 strips a day. Worse, autumn storms have churned the wilderness road into a porridge. Men wade knee-deep in mud, hoisting artillery wheels with fence rails as makeshift levers. Private John Drake of the 11th Michigan Cavalry scribbles in his diary, "It seems Providence laid every stone en route to break a horse's leg." On the 30th of September, Burbridge's vanguard reaches Jonesville, Virginia. There they capture a Confederate dispatch rider whose pouch confirms what scouts suspected. Brigadier General Alfred Jackson is fortifying the hills west of Saltville with 3 Confederate regiments of dismounted cavalry and local militia under Colonel Henry Giltner. Crucially, Jackson expects to have reinforcements from Champ Ferguson's partisan band, men with reputations dark enough to chill even the veteran troopers. Burbridge cannot afford a moment's delay. He pushes on, no rest, no forage, toward the valley. By October 1st, the rain has now turned to sleet. The columns ascend Wallen's Ridge by slippery switchback. Horses collapse, men curse, and heave them upright again. At Saltville proper, the Confederates brace for the attack. Breastworks Ridge, a sawtooth spine north of town, now sprouts freshly dug rifle pits. Jackson arrays 2,200 Confederate defenders, men from Tennessee, cadets from Virginia, and the yellow-checked caps of Giltner's Home Guard cavalry. They roll 2 old smoothbore guns atop Sanders Hill and angle them down the Gleaves Road, the only possible approach for Burbridge's own artillery. First contact happens just after 7 a.m. on October 2nd. Union skirmishers of the 11th Michigan emerge from dense cedar and trade shots with Confederate pickets. Fire crackles up the slopes. Burrows bray as shells burst overhead. Burbridge orders a probing assault. Major John Miller's brigade on the left, Colonel James Shackelford's on the right, intent on feeling for a weak seam in the Confederate lines. They don't find one. By mid-morning, visibility dips to 20 yards in gun smoke and drizzle. Burbridge decides on audacity. He'll hurl his 3rd Brigade, which includes the black regiments, straight up the ridge, pin down the rebels, and then swing around the flanks. It's a textbook double envelopment on a mountainside that seems to spurn the textbooks. Trumpet calls echo. The 5th and 6th United States Colored Cavalry dismount, form ragged firing lines, and advance. Confederate rifles crack from log parapets. Men tumble, roll backward, then rise again. Now, this is the moment where I want to interject that I have a very personal connection to this particular attack. Among the men of the 40th Kentucky Mounted Infantry in Company C, was my fourth great-grandfather, a man named Wiley Bailey, who, from everything I've read, was not a great guy, really. Addicted to alcohol, not a particularly good husband or father. But he's fighting alongside his 17-year-old son, Wiley. They enlisted together in Company C. And another company is my third great-grandfather, John Mowery, from whom I get my last name, Mowery. But it's the Baileys I want to focus on because I went a few years ago to Washington, D.C. to dig through pension records at the National Archives, and I dug into my ancestor John Bailey's pension record. There was also a record filed by John's wife, Mary, my fourth great-grandmother, which I thought was really strange because she filed this before her husband John died, and I couldn't figure out why until I dug a little deeper and realized that at some point during this October 2nd battle, their 17-year-old son Wiley was hit. And it describes in the records in vivid detail exactly how he was hit. It said that the bullet entered his neck on the left side, and it exited out his right hip. So if you just picture that in your mind, first of all, you understand right away that this is a fatal wound. You don't have a bullet enter your neck, come out your hip on the opposite side, and have it not tear through vital organs on the way. But it also gives you a picture of the nature of this battle, because the only way a bullet could do that is if he was either lying down or at least crouched in a prone position trying to fire. I can picture this in my mind. And I have a 17-year-old son. I said earlier that John Bailey was not a good person, but much of that description that I'm giving you of what kind of guy my fourth great-grandfather was comes from later in his life, when his wife described him as basically worthless because he used all his pension money on drinking and didn't support his family. But I have to wonder how much of that comes from what happened on that mountainside in October of 1864, because this is how John Bailey himself described the death of his son. He said, quote, "I was 5 or 6 paces from my son when the rebel fire struck him. I helped 2 of the boys carry him back off the road to where Dr. P.C. Bierbauer, our assistant surgeon, had his dressing station. Wiley died before an ambulance could clear the gap." Strangely enough, the official records don't record the death of Wiley Bailey in his military file. It just says that he was left in the hands of the rebels. So unfortunately, that tells you what you need to know about how this battle went. But I do want to get back to the battle itself. So the 5th and 6th U.S. Colored Cavalry are dismounted. They are charging up this hill toward the rebel emplacements. Twice they reach within pistol range of the crest of the hill. Twice fire tears open their ranks. They surge forward a third time, bayonets low, driving the rebels to abandon an outer trench. Nearby, the white regiments are stalling, tangled by deadfall, and suddenly the black troopers stand isolated on this bare slope, taking converging fire. Their commanding officer signals a retreat. The hillside returns to Confederate hands, but the charge has carved legend. Out of some 600 colored cavalry who went up that mountainside, around a third of them lie killed, wounded, or missing within an hour's fighting. Now, their sacrifice is not in vain. Jackson was rattled by the ferocity, and he pulled companies from his center to buttress the left. Burbridge seized the moment. Another of his brigades lunges forward, captures a knoll nicknamed Poorhouse Hill, and readies to unlimber horse artillery that could rake the main breastworks. Victory hangs in the air like breath. And then the fortunes reverse in a heartbeat. Scouts report fresh columns entering from Marion. Colonel George Gough's 4th Kentucky Cavalry, followed by Ferguson's guerrillas. Reinforcements have arrived for the Confederates. Musket flashes suddenly blossom on Burbridge's exposed right. Ammunition wagons are still miles to the rear. Rain-soaked powder, broken limber pins. Burbridge calculates the situation quickly and grimly. His line is stretched. His mounts are exhausted. and the enemy numbers are rising by the hour. At 3 p.m., he orders a withdrawal, masking it with a final cannonade. The retreat is orderly at first, but then desperate as cavalry need to ford swollen streams in the gathering darkness. Ambulance wagons groan under wounded of every color. Many have no space and cling to stirrups or walk, blood freezing to their boot heels. Burbridge's offensive was bold, it was improvisational, but it was ultimately stopped, and it cost him roughly 300 killed and wounded, including heavy losses among the colored regiments. Confederate casualties tally somewhere around 100 to 150. Strategically speaking, Saltville remains intact. Psychologically, both sides nurse raw anger. For some Confederates, the sight of armed black soldiers sparks a murderous rage that the official battle was unable to satisfy. Night falls, but the violence doesn't stop. In field hospitals, scratched out of barns and church naves, and on the campus of a college once attended by Jeb Stuart, wounded men lie 3 to a blanket, blue coats and gray coats sometimes touching elbows in uneasy truce. Lanterns hissed. Surgeons sawed and stitched and prayed the morphine would last until dawn. Outside the improvised wards, new riders arrive. Men without uniforms or wearing scraps of gray and brown, pistols tucked at the belt, bowie knives glinting like fangs when lantern light caught them. They called themselves independent scouts or home guards, sometimes partisan rangers. Everyone knew their leader, Champ Ferguson. Tall, long-bearded, eyes like flint quarried from the very mountaintops. Ferguson carried a personal kill ledger that may have already topped 90 by the time of this battle. Word spread quickly that black Union troopers lay wounded in the swell below Sanders Hill. To the guerrillas, these men were rebels of a different order, formerly enslaved, now armed, symbols of a South overturning itself. Ferguson and his followers rode down the slope, ignoring Jackson's staff officers who shouted to them that the battle was over. A hospital steward in the 11th Michigan later wrote, quote, "The night took on a sound, boots splashing mud, a door driven in, then the first pistol shot, and another, end quote. One black corporal had been hit in the knee. He managed to drag himself behind a feed trough and watched through a chink in the boards as lantern beams stabbed across the barn. One by one, the beams halted on men in Union blue, the black wounded soldiers. Shots rang out. This particular corporal counted 24 shots before he stopped counting. He survived by feigning death, his face pressed into rank straw until the marauders had left. Historians debate the numbers. Federal burial parties found at least 45 murdered black soldiers. Some estimates put it past 100. A few Confederate sources say it was somewhere under a dozen. All agree that black soldiers were murdered that night. They were all black cavalrymen, or in a few cases, possibly their white officers who tried to shield them. Dr. William Hawes of the 6th Indiana Cavalry testified later that several bodies showed powder burns to the temple, evidence of how close the guns were when they were fired. By sunrise, the Holston River fog mixed with gun smoke until the valley smelled of both brine and blood. Stephen Burbridge, miles on the retreat road by this point, would not learn of the full horror for a number of days. When he did, his report to General Grant crackled with a restrained fury. He said, quote, "The barbarities practiced upon the colored troops are unparalleled in modern warfare," end quote. Northern newspapers picked up the phrase and ran editorial columns titled, "Remember Saltville." But no brigade swung instantly south in reprisal. The armies were already stretched, winter was closing, and justice would have to wait. For Champ Ferguson, the massacre was neither an aberration or something he showed any remorse over. He boasted to acquaintances later that he had, quote, finished the job the bullets had started, end quote. A year later, he would stand before a military tribunal in Nashville, tried for 53 murders, Saltville figuring prominently among them. He offered no apology, only shrugged that war was war. The gallows answered him with his death on October 20th, 1865. One of only 3 men that we know of who were executed for war crimes in the aftermath of the American Civil War. With Ferguson's execution, many people forgot about what happened at the Saltville Massacre, but memory kept the massacre alive for many of the veterans of the U.S. Colored Troops regiments. They formed posts of the Grand Army of the Republic much like their white counterparts did. And in their meetings, every meeting was opened with a roll call of the Saltville dead. Black communities in central Kentucky observed October 2nd as a day of fasting well into the 1890s. The Saltville Massacre reminds us that a battle's final casualty often falls long after the guns are silent, and that freedom purchased on the field of battle can still be built again overnight. In Saltville, the price was measured in borrowed lantern light, in boots across the mud, in pistol sounds muffled by barn rafters, and its echoes linger still. Dawn broke over Saltville on October 3rd, 1864, with a silence so complete it felt blasphemous. The valley that had roared with rifles the day before now heard only the drip of brine kettles cooling and the caw of winter crows. Union dead dotted the slopes. Confederate burial details moved among them with shovels and lowered voices. In town, enslaved laborers stoked the furnaces again, proof that on paper at least, the South had kept its salt. 50 miles away, Stephen Burbridge read casualty tallies by lantern light. His raid had failed. Worse, the massacre had stained every report with horror. In a dispatch to General Grant, he wrote, quote, I require a column twice this size and 3 times the speed, or these works will stand, end quote. The lesson for the Union was unmistakable. Piecemeal assaults against entrenched ridgelines invited carnage without payoff. If Saltville was to fail, it must be through mobility, surprise, and overwhelming numbers, not stubborn frontal assaults. Inside Confederate lines, a different reckoning unfolded. General Alfred Jackson boasted to Richmond that, quote, the enemy skulked home whipped. Yet his engineers submitted nervous inventories. 2 boilers were cracked, 1 brine main was severed, half the earthen parapets were cratered by Union shell fire. Repairs would take weeks, maybe even months, and winter demand was rising. Privatized salt contractors grumbled that another raid could finish them for good. Even Champ Ferguson's men, flush with grim triumph, rode out carrying wounded comrades and empty cartridge boxes, a reminder that guerrilla fury alone could not hold the valley forever. Richmond's War Department urged fresh reinforcements, but at the front, in Petersburg, every spare regiment was already bleeding men. In effect, the Confederacy gambled that mountain geography and home guard resolve would have to suffice a second time. Northern newspapers disagreed. Headlines from Cincinnati to Boston thundered, "Remember Saltville!" Public outrage pressed Washington to avenge the butchered colored troops and to choke the Confederacy's salt arteries once and for all. Within weeks, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton approved a new plan, this time under Major General George Stoneman, and it would include 10 cavalry regiments, horse artillery, and orders to render the works wholly useless. Thus, out of blood and failure came cold arithmetic on both sides. For the Union, it needed to be bigger and faster. For the Confederacy, patchwork defenses and dwindling odds. The board was reset, the pieces were heavier, and the stakes were sharper. I want to invite you to join me in episode 2, which will come out in the next couple of days, as we take a look at the second Saltville Raid. Thanks for listening.